Fellas, we're going to be trading UFC fighters for fighters from different promotions. So fighters that could potentially leave the UFC in order to bring other fighters from other organizations into the UFC, which I would think would make a fair trade between fighters. And we'll go in there with the first trade, which is going to be Tai Tuivasa being traded from the UFC. We're going to have to say our goodbyes to Tai Tuivasa. And the fighter who I've chosen to trade in the promotion is from PFL, and I'm going to be bringing Vadim Nemkov to the heavyweight division. Vadim Nemkov, he's kind of been jumping between light heavyweight and heavyweight, but he's on a complete roll outside of the UFC. He's been competing in Bellator and recently come over to PFL, and he's even in the heavyweight division. I know he had a predominantly career in the light heavyweight division, but even in the heavyweight division, he's been doing his thing, and I think he'd bring some value to the UFC. Main reason is he would be an instant top 5 heavyweight. He's one of the best heavyweights right now outside of the UFC, in my opinion. I reckon he'd 100% be top 10. He's got top 5 potential. He's a very, very good grappler who can strike. He's a light heavyweight who moved up, but he's had a successful move to the heavyweight division. And unlike Tai Tuivasa, I think he'd add another contender to the heavyweight division, which is a division that's deprived of contenders, and he's the only real big fighter apart from Ngannou outside the UFC who could compete in the heavyweight division, and he's a potential competitor to Aspinall. I know that might seem a bit far-fetched and a bit too far, and he is a bit out of his prime, but listen, you bring him over to the UFC, you give him a Cyril Gane, he takes down Gane and submits him, you've got Aspinall's next opponent. So Vadim Nemkov to trade for Tai Tuivasa. Now, the reason I've decided to trade him with Tai Tuivasa is mainly because Tuivasa is on a losing streak and he's never going to be a top heavyweight. He had that big fight with Cyril Gane. And listen, I like Tai Tuivasa, but let's not kid ourselves here. He's never going to be a top heavyweight. He's on a 5-fight losing streak, somehow still ranked number 12 in the division despite that. But he isn't going to be a top heavyweight. Even if he picks up a knockout win, he's not going to work himself up, in my opinion, to be a top heavyweight. I don't see a big future for Tai Tuivasa at this moment in time, but he is a bigger name than Vadim Nemkov. I'm sure worldwide more people know Tuivasa than Nemkov, and he could probably KO a few bums on the PFL. You're bringing over to PFL, you said, listen, we've got this fun heavyweight, Tai Tuivasa, you don't need to make him into a star, he's already a star. Let him KO a few of your bums and then maybe make a name for himself in PFL. I think Tuivasa could add some value to PFL, but as of right now, in the UFC, he isn't really bringing much. It wouldn't be surprising if he takes another loss or two, and within 2 years, he's gone from the organization. So I feel like trading while he's hot. Same for Nemkov, to be fair. Nemkov's getting up there in age. I would trade Tai Tuivasa and Vadim Nemkov. I think that's a fair trade. They're both coming up towards the end of their career. Tuivasa, trade him, give PFL a big name, and in return, we can get a new contender in the heavyweight division, which we kind of need in this division. Trade number 2. Listen, I know this is going to upset a lot of people. We're going to say goodbye to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and he's going to be traded with Cedric Doumbé. I think this would be a very good kind of trade between the UFC and PFL. I think it's a very fair trade. Cedric Doumbé is a huge star. I think he's one of the biggest stars outside the UFC in Europe. He is absolutely massive in Paris. In fact, I think he's bigger than Cyril Gane in terms of French MMA. What value does he bring? Like I just said, superstar in Paris. The UFC tends to go to Paris on a yearly basis, and it's either Benoit Saint-Denis or Cyril Gane headlining it, and both of those guys aren't in the best career spot right now. And I'm not acting like Cedric Doumbé is a top welterweight, but bringing over to the UFC, this guy's going to sell out a stadium in France, and it can be a bigger stadium than the one's been going to recently, and he's a potential top 15 prospect. I don't think he'd ever become a champion in the UFC, but he's a very good striker. He's a top 15 prospect. I think he'd add a lot of fun to the welterweight division in replacement of Stephen Thompson, who also is a good striker in the welterweight division, but does seem to be on his way out. And yeah, I just think bringing over Cedric Doumbé, who's a huge star. I mean, he had the guy at Mbappe, is damn sure, got an 8-second knockout and won a bonus in PFL. I think he'd bring a lot of value to the UFC. He did used to be in the UFC, and then they decided to cut him for some reason. And the reason why I traded him with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, I think that's a fair trade, is because, listen, Stephen Thompson, he's realistically got about a year or two left. I don't think we're going to be seeing Stephen Thompson in the UFC coming into 2026. Definitely not 2027. So it isn't like he's got a long prime left of his career, even though he has had the better longevity compared to 40-year-olds, and he's out of his prime. He's not performing the same way. It's not the same Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. The last good Thompson performance we had was when he fought Kevin Holland, but he's a well-known name for the PFL top 10. I'm not saying he's as big as a star as Cedric Doumbé. I'd say worldwide they're probably the same. In Europe, Doumbé is probably a bit bigger, but he's still a big star, and he probably beats a few guys at the top. He's not awful, he's Stephen Thompson. You know, he was making it competitive with Buckley, so he could probably beat a few guys at the top of the PFL chain. But in the UFC right now, even though he's still ranked worthy, I'm not sure he would bring as much value to the organization as somebody like Cedric Doumbé, who's a massive star, and he's a fun fighter, and he's winning consistency, would bring. So I would trade Cedric Doumbé from PFL over to the UFC and give PFL Stephen Wonderboy Thompson to beat a couple of their top 10 guys. Trade number 3, Rose Namajunas, get out. Rose Namajunas needs to get out the UFC, and I think this is a fair trade. This is actually probably the biggest trades the UFC could do, and I never thought I'd say this because it's women MMA, but Dakota Ditcheva. If you've been on this channel for a while, you'll know how much I've been hyping up Dakota Ditcheva. Not just because she's from the UK and I've got Brit bias, but she's super talented. She is a women MMA knockout artist. She's got 14 wins, 13 finishes, 12 knockouts. She just beat the crap out of Talia Santos, who went to a very close, controversial decision with Valentina Shevchenko. She's a machine. What value does she bring? What value doesn't she bring? You know what I mean? Like, she's a female KO artist, unlike Rose Namajunas, who's become a bit of a point fighter. I know she had that KO over Zhang Weili a few years ago, but since then her career's gone downhill, and she'd become a UFC champion. I believe you bring Dakota Ditcheva over to the UFC strawweight division, at some point she would become a champion. I'm not saying you need to give her an immediate title shot, but I reckon whenever, like, she's still young, within her time she is becoming a UFC champion. And I'm saying it here, like, now the way that she performed against Talia Santos proved to me that she's very talented, and she's a fun fighter, fun personality. I think she'd be a women MMA star. I'm not going to sit here and say that she's the next big Ronda Rousey or the next big pay-per-view draw, but she's a fun fighter. She's got personality. She knows how to make a name for herself. She's already a star in PFL. I think she would be I think she right now is by far the most valuable women MMA fighter outside of the UFC. She needs to be brought up to the UFC as soon as possible. She's not completely wrote it off, but she's staying in PFL because of the money, and the fact that the UFC doesn't pay well. And the reason I trade her with Rose Namajunas is because Namajunas, she's no longer a top contender. This isn't the title, you know, Rose Namajunas that we were talking about a couple of years ago. She's not even near the champion belt anymore, is Rose Namajunas. And she brings nothing to the UFC. She's not overly entertaining. She hasn't got any personality apart from just saying, I'm the best over and over again, like she's got dementia. But yeah, she just don't really bring anything to the UFC, but she is still one of the most well-known women MMA fighters, former champion, fought a bunch of the top guys, or top women, should I say, in the strawweight and the flyweight division. So I think you could trade her with Rose Namajunas, bring her over to the UFC, and she probably becomes a PFL champion. Even though she's not champion worthy in the UFC, we know that there's difference between the levels. So I think Rose Namajunas, bring her over to the flyweight or the strawweight, whatever division you want in the PFL, and I think she could become a champion in PFL. But as of right now in the UFC, she just doesn't really bring much value. She fights once or twice a year. She's a bit of a win-loss fighter, not the most interesting fighter, so doesn't really have finishing ability. So yeah, I just think this is a fair trade. We need Dakota Ditcheva in the UFC. She's a huge women MMA star. She would probably, I'm not going to say she's going to save the strawweight division, but if she can go on a reign, she could become the next big thing in replacement for Namajunas, who's still a big name, former champion, isn't as valuable. Trade number 4. Deiveson Figueiredo. This one hurt a lot because Figueiredo is one of the only guys on this list who's like genuinely a top and potentially a future champion. I know he's a former champion, but a future champion in the UFC. I would trade him with Patchy Mix. You know Patchy Mix, competed in Bellator. I don't think he's gone to PFL yet, but he was in Bellator and he's been out for quite some time. I think this could be a fair trade because Patchy Mix is very valuable and so is Figueiredo. Patchy Mix is a huge star outside of the UFC. He's only had one loss in his entire career by decision. Apart from that, he's been just straight finishing people with submissions. He's been very vocal on Twitter and about the UFC. What value does he bring? He's one of the biggest names outside the UFC. I'll get onto this in a minute, but yeah, he's a huge name outside the UFC. Patchy Mix has always been up there with the likes of Pitbull and AJ McKee for being the guys outside of the UFC who could potentially be top fighters in the UFC. So I think now that we've signed the likes of Pitbull, what's to say we can't get Patchy Mix over? He's a top 5 UFC bantamweight. Bantamweight is the most competitive division in the UFC. I think Patchy Mix instantly makes it into the top 5. I'm not saying he's an immediate champion, but I imagine him versus O'Malley or another grappler in his a grappler in his debut. Massive star outside the UFC. I think he'd sell as well because he's been trash talking a lot of guys on Twitter, disrespecting the UFC, bringing over, let him face those guys. You kind of need Patchy Mix in the UFC at this moment in time, and I would trade him with Figgy. It's not easy to say goodbye to Figgy, but he's already lived a great UFC career. This isn't a prospect that has a ton of potential that we're getting rid of. Figueiredo, yes, he's in his prime, but he's already become a champion on multiple different occasions. He's already had a great UFC career. If he was to hang it up now, it wouldn't be the end of the world, and he probably doesn't become a champion. I say probably because he looked really good in his last couple of fights, even in his loss to PTN, but realistically, he probably isn't going to become a champion and beat Marab. So I think, you know, sending him off to PFL, but he would 100% become a champion in PFL. If PFL see Figgy, you've got a former UFC champion, a guy who's still at the top of the chain in the UFC, and a guy that's obviously a big star. If you took I know I just said PFL even though we're going to do it with Bellator, but I'm assuming they're the same thing now. If you bring Figgy over to PFL, he's immediately becoming the top fighter in the bantamweight division. So I think Figgy, as good as he's in the UFC, and the fact that I don't want to see him go, is nowhere near washed. I think if we're trading him for Patchy Mix, another big name, I think that could be a bit of a fair trade. More than fair for Bellator, to be honest, or should I say PFL now. Anyway, trade number 5, Brian Ortega. He's got to go, blood. Send Brian Ortega out the UFC and bring in Brendan Loughnane. I think this is a fair trade. Brian Ortega's lost a lot of value over the years, and I think trading it for Brendan Loughnane's fair. Brendan Loughnane's taken a couple of losses. I'm not saying he's going to be a UFC champion, but he's a fun fighter. He's had a lot of wins in his career. He actually fought in the Contender Series a few years back, ended up, I think, winning on the Contender Series, but he decided not to go through with it, and he went over to PFL instead. What value does he bring? Fun, dangerous heavyweight. Listen, him and Brian Ortega are in a similar situation where if they were in the UFC, they're not becoming a UFC champion. I'm going to say it straight. Brendan Loughnane doesn't become a UFC champion, but I'd say he's funner than Brian Ortega. I'd say he's more dangerous than Brian Ortega. He's definitely more active than Brian Ortega, and I think he would bring more to the featherweight division than Brian Ortega would, and he's an instant top 10 featherweight, potentially even top 5. Again, it's hard to gouge considering he isn't on his huge winning streak in PFL, and coming over to the big league might be different, but I think he'd be an instant top 10 heavyweight. So I think bringing over Brendan Loughnane from PFL, another guy from the UK who you can use to kind of build the UK market, which seems to be growing in the UFC, would be a fair trade in replacement with Brian Ortega. Why would I trade Brian Ortega? First reason, he brings nothing to the UFC in 2025, and I'm not trying to disrespect Ortega. He's been in so many good fights, to fight with Volk, to fight with Holloway, but in 2025, he doesn't bring much. He fights about once a year. He's a bit of a win-loss fighter. I don't really know what's going on between weight classes. He's looking big these days, so he doesn't really bring much to the UFC, and he's washed. Brian Ortega's past his prime now. I know he beat Yair last year, but I just don't think he's in his prime. This isn't the same Brian Ortega that was facing the likes of Volkanovski and Holloway anymore, and by the way, he lost those fights. He's in a completely different area now within his career, but again, another big name for PFL. You know, PFL, everybody knows Brian Ortega, and he's champion material for PFL. Being a top 5 featherweight in the UFC probably means you could win a belt in PFL, so that's what the PFL are getting out of Brian Ortega. They're getting a star who might be past his prime, but it's a fresh start and a fresh organization with a fresh roster, and he probably becomes their champion, and he's already a big star, so they don't need to rebuild him. So Brendan Loughnane, I think, as of right now, would bring a lot more to the UFC, and he's won on the Contender Series to kind of prove that he's at least UFC worthy. Trade number 6, Ian Garry. This is one of the fighters similar to Figueiredo, where it's like we're trading a fighter who's just entering their prime, and this one is going to sting seeing Ian Garry go, because I want to see Ian Garry in the UFC, but I've traded him for Shamil Moussaev. I think Shamil Moussaev is one of the only fighters outside the UFC who I would trade Ian Garry for. Shamil Moussaev, he's fucking insane. This guy is undefeated, and he's a complete knockout machine from Dagestan. He's had a couple of decisions in there, but the vast majority of his wins, even towards the later half of his career, have been by knockout. What value does he bring to the UFC? He could genuinely beat Belal Muhammad. I'm not even trying to exaggerate this. He is a nightmare matchup for Belal Muhammad, and I think he's an instant title contender. This isn't some, fighter that we're bringing over to the UFC where, he could potentially make it into the top 10. He might be a bit of a star because, it's got to be worth leaving Ian Garry. I think he could beat Belal Muhammad, and I think he could immediately become a title contender in the division of the welterweight division. He's a KO artist with elite takedown defense. He is a KO artist from Dagestan. He's not one of these boring Dagestani wrestlers that a lot of people like to hate on. He's got elite takedown defense, KO artist. I think he'd add so much interest to the welterweight division. Imagine him versus Belal or Shavkat. He's very talented outside the UFC. Huge winning streak. I mean, the guy's undefeated. We need Shamil Moussaev in the UFC, hopefully, to come in the UFC. I think he'd be a champion. Or at least I think he'd be a terrible matchup for Belal Muhammad specifically. And I think trading him for Ian Garry would be fair. Why would I say goodbye to Ian Garry? First reason, it wouldn't ruin the UFC by leaving Ian Garry. Listen, Ian Garry brings a lot of value to the UFC. You love him, you hate him. Most people hate him, but at least you're still watching Ian Garry. It wouldn't ruin the UFC by saying goodbye to Ian Garry, if we're being completely honest. He might leave and we might lose another contender, but at least we're getting one replaced. And he would genuinely be a champion in PFL and could reign for years. He could win a UFC belt, like a PFL belt instantly. I mean, the guy was close to beating Shavkat, and I think he could reign the PFL for years. If you give Ian Garry a chance at the PFL title shot in replacement for Moussaev, I don't think anybody beats Ian Garry in PFL, if I'm being honest with you. So Ian Garry, yes, he's in his prime. Yes, he's still a top contender in the welterweight division, but I think it's worth saying goodbye to Ian Garry in order to bring in Shamil Moussaev, because I just think Shamil Moussaev's just that damn good. Number 7, Michael Chandler. Get out the UFC, boy. Get out the UFC, Michael Chandler. We're replacing you with Paul Hughes. I was going to say Usman Nurmagomedov, but considering that Makhachev's in the UFC, I don't think they'd trade Usman Nurmagomedov, because I don't think, well, it goes without saying, they're not going to fight each other. Paul Hughes just had a huge fight with Usman Nurmagomedov, one of the biggest non-UFC fights we've had in a while. There was so much hype around this event. Ireland versus Dagestan, Paul Hughes versus Usman Nurmagomedov. So he is a bit of a big star outside the UFC. What value does he bring? Definitely a top 10 lightweight. Paul Hughes is very talented. To to perform like that against Usman Nurmagomedov, who most people would say is at least top 3, top 5 worthy in the UFC, proved that he's at least a top 10 lightweight. This isn't just, you know, some bum from a different organization that happens to compete at 155. It'd be a top 10 lightweight in the UFC. And there's just so many fun fights from him in the UFC. He's a very fun fighter, is Paul Hughes. Very good anti-grappler, good boxing, great strike. He showed that against Usman in their fight. There's a lot of fun fights in the lightweight division at the 155 for him, I think, at this moment in time. So I think bringing over Paul Hughes, who's also got personality as well, would be a good addition to the UFC roster. You know, leaving Ian Garry, the Irish talent, bringing over some more Irish talent to the UFC, welcome Paul Hughes. I think that's fair. Now, why have I replaced him with Michael Chandler? Chandler is inactive. I know he's actually kind of been active fairly recently, fought in December and now he's going to be fighting in April, but previous to that he hadn't fought since 2022, and he's shown that he's not a top fighter. The dude's 2-4 in the UFC. Yes, it's to the best, but his 2 wins is to Tony Ferguson and Dan Hooker. He is not a top fighter, and I don't think he'd be as active as Paul Hughes, and he's probably done within 2 years. If we're being real, Michael Chandler, even when joining the UFC, he was already on the later half of his career after coming from Bellator, so he's probably done with his career within 2 years. I don't think he'd be entering 2027 in the UFC, whereas Paul Hughes, I think he has a long future ahead of him. That's why I trade Michael Chandler, and he's a huge name for PFL. Michael Chandler's probably top 20, top 25 biggest names in the UFC right now, so without a doubt he'd be one of the biggest names for PFL. So they're getting a bigger name than Paul Hughes in my opinion. So Michael Chandler, this mega name in the UFC. Maybe the UFC would like to be loyal to Michael Chandler, but I think I kind of feel bad for him. You know, the guy wanted the McGregor fight, now we're kicking him out the UFC, but hey, that's what you get for hitting Oliveira in the back of the head, bitch. Anyway, next trade, Paulo Costa. This one doesn't sting for the UFC as much, getting rid of Paulo Costa, and I would trade him for Johnny Eblen. I know this might be seem a bit disrespectful to Paulo Costa because there's a lot of hate on Johnny Eblen and his style and everything, but I think this is a fair trade for the UFC. You know, it's not like a title contention trade. Johnny Eblen has been on a huge winning streak. You know, he's been a huge winning streak in Bellator. He is a bit of a decision machine. He's not the most interesting fighter, but what value does he bring? Dominant middleweight outside the UFC. Listen, he's not the most fun fighter. I'm going to be completely honest with you right now. I'm not going to act like he'd be in barn burners in the UFC, but he's a dominant middleweight outside the UFC. He's undefeated, you know, and I think on top of that, he could probably sell a few fights. He's kind of talked shit about the UFC and a couple of the guys in the UFC for quite some time. I think bringing him over to the UFC, there'd be a bit of hype, give him somebody in the top 10 and see if he's really that dominant, or maybe diminish Bellator even more, or PFL even more. So I think Johnny Eblen could be replaced. Bring him over to the UFC. He seems to be doing his thing in Bellator, and I want to see how he does in the UFC now. I would trade him with Paulo Costa. Why him? He's inactive as fuck. Costa might be one of the most inactive fighters in the UFC. He obviously fought in 2021 against Marvin Vettori, took about a year off, comes back late 2022 against Luke Rockhold, then comes back 2024 against Whitaker and Strickland, and now he's still not back. He's super inactive. His career's genuinely going to be done within a few years, and he's not even top 15 worthy. Who is he beating in the UFC? Luke Rockhold and Yoel Romero. Well done, you've beat some decrepit old men. You ain't beat a single guy. He hasn't actually beaten a single fighter currently signed to the UFC. That's crazy. Not top 15 worthy. But he's a big name, big personality for PFL, and I think the trade, I think for the PFL, Paulo Costa would bring a lot more value to the PFL than Johnny Eblen would at this moment in time, and he would make for so many badass fights. Listen, he might not be as dominant as Johnny Eblen, but at least he'd make for so many more fun fights, and he'd be able to sell fights more. Listen, you know what you're getting with Paulo Costa. The guy can promote a fight. When it's Paulo Costa Fight Week, everybody knows about it, so I think he'd add a lot of value to the PFL. Johnny Eblen would be a better name for the UFC in terms of dominance, maybe not in terms of fun fights, but it isn't like Costa fights on a regular basis anyway, so bring over Johnny Eblen, see how good he's in the UFC. I think that's a pretty fair trade for Costa and Johnny Eblen. Trade number 9, Nassourdine Imavov. Another one of these that is kind of tough because Imavov's in his prime and he's on a roll right now. He could potentially be a champion within 12 months for all we know. Now, it's got to be worth trading Imavov. Who am I trading him for? I'm trading him for Anatoly Malikin. Anatoly Malikin, if you don't know who this guy is, he was the triple champion in ONE FC, the middleweight, light heavyweight, and the heavyweight champion. I've decided that I'm going to put him in the middleweight division. Again, I don't really know what weight he's going to be fighting at soon. I assume he probably can't make middleweight, but either way, fuck it. We've traded him anyway. Why would I trade him? He has one of the biggest MMA accolades outside the UFC, being a triple champion. And I know there's triple champions in like shitty organizations, but ONE FC is a legitimate organization. It's not PFL level, but it's still a big organization. So I think trading him bringing him over to the UFC would have a ton of hype. He beat Reina Dorita too, and I think there's a bunch of fun fights from him in the middleweight division. I think he'd instantly be a top 10 middleweight. I think if we're being real, Nassourdine Imavov has a better chance of becoming a top contender and maybe a title contender, but I think Anatoly Malikin would be funner, and he'd have a lot more hype coming into the UFC because of what he'd achieved outside the UFC. So I think bringing over Anatoly Malikin, the 3-time ONE FC champion, well, 3-weight division ONE FC champion with a ton of hype, over to the UFC would be the right move. And Imavov, why would I trade him? He probably won't materialize into a champion in a start. I say probably again because we don't know this. He's still a top contender. But we've got Chimaev in the middleweight division. We're going to be sorted. We've got Dricus. We've got Chimaev. We've got Caio Borralho. Imavov's just another one of those names, and he probably won't become a superstar like Anatoly could, or a champion. But he's immediately a ONE FC champion. You bring Imavov over to ONE FC, immediately a ONE FC champion. Similar to how Demetrius Johnson got traded for Ben Askren. You send Nassourdine Imavov over there, so many fun fights. The ONE FC are going to sort him out. They're going to pay him the right fights. They're going to give him the right fights, and he's not losing that belt in ONE FC. That's why I trade Imavov. I think he's still talented in the UFC, still a title contender, but I don't think it'd hurt as much by saying goodbye to Nassourdine Imavov as it would maybe some other guys in the middleweight division. So that'll be a trade that I think would be fair. And finally, Steve Erceg. I'm not trying to kick a man when he's down. You know, I'm not trying to kick him when he's on a 3-fight losing streak and say, get out the UFC. I like Steve Erceg a lot. But I think this is a fair trade, and if you know the guy I'm about to trade him with, you'll understand why I've been trading him with this guy, Lewis McGrillen. I've been following Lewis McGrillen before he was even a professional, since his amateur days. I've literally watched the entire build-up of Lewis McGrillen since the beginning of his professional career to right now, and man, this guy could be the next McGregor. I'm not even just making this shit up. He looks like a lunatic and he fights like one too. He's a complete KO machine for the flyweight division, 10 wins by knockout, only 1 decision, and he had an absolute fight of the year contender in PFL, where there were 14 knockdowns in a single fight, and he finished it. What value does he bring? He would be a superstar in the flyweight division. He's a mini McGregor, not only because of his fighting style, not only because of his personality, but everything around Lewis McGrillen. He would be one of the biggest UK names. If you do a UK event at some point, I know we've just had UFC London, and you have Lewis McGrillen, maybe he's like a main event in the flyweight division, holy shit, you'd have a new star on your hands. Extremely fun to watch. One of the funnest fighters, just comes to brawl every single time. Knockout machine and a fight of the night machine. This guy would be a walking bonus. He's like the Justin Gaethje of the flyweight division. The UFC need to bring this guy over. Really fun personality too. Knows how to sell a fight, knows how to build a fight. Lewis McGrillen, get him inside of the UFC. He won the PFL, well, he became a PFL champion, ended up winning the 100k bonus. I think he'd be super valuable, and he's one of the best names that the UFC need to sign. Now, why would I trade him with Steve Erceg of all people? Am I just trying to kick him on when he's down? No. Steve Erceg, we've already seen him against the top guys of the flyweight division. He's not like a prospect who could potentially materialize into his massive name. We've seen him against Pantoja, we've seen him against Moreno, we've seen him against Kai Kara France. Now, fair enough, some of those were really close, but we've seen him against the top guys, and he's fallen short. So it isn't like a massive, oh my gosh, this guy could have been the next big thing. Next reason, he's on a 3-fight losing streak. He's not as valuable as he might have been when he just lost to Pantoja or when he just beat Match Now. You know, he's on a losing streak, but he would become the best PFL flyweight. You send Steve Erceg over to PFL, I genuinely believe, because of his performances against Pantoja and Moreno, he would be the best flyweight in the world at PFL, and obviously that's going to be a lot more valuable. So, and he's still got a bright future ahead of him. What's to say that Steve Erceg, even in the UFC, can't, you know, get back to the drawing board, improve, and become a champion in the future? Based off what we've seen him against Moreno and Pantoja, he could do that. He isn't just a washed-up UFC star that's trying to fight a couple more times, so we need to send him over to PFL. Steve Erceg's got a bright future. So I think the future of Steve Erceg, it still tends to be promising. He'd be the best flyweight in PFL. A lot of people know him already because of these big, high-profile fights with the likes of Moreno and Pantoja, so I think that's fair. And in return, the UFC get another young prospect in Lewis McGrillen, who we're still not sure if he's UFC worthy, but either way, he'd be a hell of a fun fighter, and I think he'd honestly be the biggest star in the flyweight division. That's not an exaggeration, but those are some trades I would do for the UFC, well, for PFL, UFC, some cross-promotion trades if there was to ever happen, and trades that I think would be fair in similar weight classes. Let me know your thoughts, and if you agree, disagree. Thank you for watching.